Introduction: The Statue That Didn't Look Right. In September 1983, an art dealer named Gianfranco Becchina approached the J. Paul Getty Museum in California with a remarkable offer. He claimed to possess a marble statue from the 6th century BC known as a kouros, a sculpture of a nude male youth standing with his left leg forward and arms at his sides. Such statues are incredibly rare, with only about 200 in existence, most of which have been recovered in fragments or badly damaged condition. This one, however, was nearly perfect. Standing close to 7 feet tall and radiating a faint, light-colored glow, it was an extraordinary find. The asking price was just under $10 million. The Getty Museum moved with caution. They took the statue on loan and launched a thorough investigation. Their experts compared it to other known kouroi, such as the Anavissos kouros in Athens, and found the style consistent with the time period. Becchina provided documents tracing the statue's recent history to a Swiss physician's private collection in the 1930s. To verify its age, a geologist from the University of California, Stanley Margolis, spent 2 days examining the surface with a high-resolution stereo microscope. He analyzed a core sample from below the right knee using electron microscopy, mass spectrometry, and X-ray diffraction. His conclusion was definitive. The statue was made of dolomite marble from the ancient Cape Varthi quarry on the island of Thasos, and its surface was covered in a thin layer of calcite. This detail was crucial because dolomite takes hundreds, if not thousands of years to turn into calcite. The science said the statue was old. It was not a contemporary fake. Satisfied with the evidence, the Getty purchased the statue 14 months later. By the fall of 1986, the kouros went on display, celebrated in a front-page story by the New York Times and a glowing article by the museum's curator of antiquities, Marion True. She wrote of the statue's confident vitality and radiant energy, hailing it as a masterpiece of Western art's adolescence. Yet, despite the scientific validation and the legal documentation, the statue had a problem. It didn't look right. The first hint of trouble came from Federico Zeri, an Italian art historian on the Getty's board of trustees. When he visited the restoration studio in December 1983, he found himself fixated on the sculpture's fingernails. He couldn't articulate exactly why, but they seemed wrong. Next came Evelyn Harrison, a renowned expert on Greek sculpture. When the curator swished the cloth off the statue to reveal it to her, she didn't feel awe. She felt an instinctive sense that something was amiss. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said upon learning the museum was about to buy it. A few months later, Thomas Hoving, former director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, visited the studio. Hoving had a habit of noting the first word that popped into his head when seeing something new. When he saw the kouros, the word was fresh. It was not the reaction one expects for a 2,000-year-old artifact. The statue looked as if it had just been dipped in cafe au latte. He asked the curator, stunned, if they had paid for it yet. "If you have, try to get your money back," he advised. "If you haven't, don't." Worried by these reactions, the Getty convened a symposium in Greece, shipping the statue to Athens for inspection by the country's most senior experts. The chorus of dismay grew louder. George Despinis, head of the Acropolis Museum, took one look and blanched, stating that anyone who had seen sculpture coming out of the ground could tell this thing had never been buried. Georgios Dontas of the Archaeological Society felt as though a glass stood between him and the work. Angelos Delavorius, director of the Benaki Museum, spoke of the contradiction between the style and the marble, but his core reaction was more visceral, a wave of intuitive repulsion. The consensus among the experts was that the kouros was a fake. The Getty's lawyers and scientists had spent months building a case for its authenticity, yet these experts in a single glance had reached the opposite conclusion. Over time, the Getty's case unraveled. The documents tracing the statue to the Swiss physician turned out to be forgeries, with postal codes and bank accounts that didn't exist at the purported dates. The style of the sculpture was revealed to be a confusing pastiche of different periods. Even the scientific evidence crumbled when another geologist discovered that the surface could be aged artificially using potato mold. The experts who had felt that instant repulsion were right. In the first 2 seconds of looking, they had understood more about the statue than the museum's team had in 14 months of analysis. 1. Fast and frugal. To understand how such instant judgments work, consider a simple gambling experiment conducted by scientists at the University of Iowa. Imagine sitting before 4 decks of cards, 2 red and 2 blue. Your task is to turn over cards to maximize your winnings. Unbeknownst to you, the red decks are a minefield. They offer high rewards but catastrophic penalties. The blue decks, conversely, offer steady, modest payouts and small penalties. The only way to win is to stick to the blue decks. The experiment showed that after turning over about 50 cards, most people develop a hunch that the blue decks are better. By 80 cards, they can explain exactly why the red decks are a bad idea. This is the conscious learning process. We gather experience, think it through, and form a logical theory. It is slow and deliberate. But the scientists also monitored the subject's sweat glands. They found that gamblers began generating stress responses to the red decks by the 10th card, 40 cards before they could articulate a hunch. More importantly, their behavior changed around the same time. They started favoring the blue cards long before they were consciously aware of the strategy. They had figured out the game before they realized they had figured it out. This experiment illustrates that our brains use two different strategies to make sense of the world. The first is the conscious strategy, logical, definitive, but slow. The second strategy operates quickly and below the surface of consciousness. It detects patterns and sends messages through indirect channels, like the sweat on our palms. This second strategy is what the art experts used when they looked at the Kouros. They didn't weigh every piece of evidence. They engaged in what cognitive psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer calls fast and frugal thinking. Their brains performed instant calculations, producing a feeling, a fresh look, an intuitive repulsion, before any conscious thought could form. They knew the statue was fake, without immediately knowing why. 2. The internal computer. The part of our brain responsible for these leaps is the adaptive unconscious. This is not the dark, murky unconscious of Freud, filled with repressed desires. Instead, it is a kind of giant computer that quickly and quietly processes the data we need to function. When a truck bears down on us in the street, we don't have time to consciously deliberate our options. We rely on this decision-making apparatus to act instantly. We toggle back and forth between these modes. Inviting a coworker to dinner is a conscious decision. Getting into an argument with them might be an impulsive reaction from the adaptive unconscious. This system is active whenever we meet someone new, interview a job candidate, or face a high-pressure decision. Psychologist Nalini Ambady demonstrated the power of this system by showing students 10-second silent video clips of a teacher they had never met. The students rated the teacher's effectiveness, and their ratings were remarkably consistent with those of students who had sat in the teacher's class for an entire semester. Even when the clips were cut to 2 seconds, the results remained the same. A person watching a 2-second clip can reach conclusions similar to those formed after months of interaction. This is the power of our adaptive unconscious, thin slicing experience to find patterns. We are often suspicious of this rapid cognition. We live in a society that values the accumulation of information and deliberate thought. We teach our children to look before you leap and stop and think. We trust the decision made after long deliberation, like the Getty's 14-month investigation, more than the snap judgment. But there are moments, especially in times of stress or complexity, when haste does not make waste, when our first impressions offer a better means of making sense of the world. However, these instincts can also betray us. The Getty bought the fake Kouros because their experts' initial repulsive feelings were thwarted by compelling scientific data and a desperate desire for the statue to be real. Our unconscious is powerful, but it is fallible. It can be thrown off by our desires, emotions, and prejudices. The task is to learn when to trust this internal computer and when to be wary of it. Just as we educate our conscious minds, we can educate and control our snap judgments. 3. A different and better world. This narrative is not about broad themes or analyzing the world from a distance. It is concerned with the smallest components of our lives, the fleeting moments when we form instantaneous impressions. We often pay too much attention to grand themes and too little to these critical instants. But if we took our instincts seriously, if we examined our decision-making through a microscope, it would change everything. It would alter how wars are fought, how police are trained, how movies are made, and how we interact with one another. Acknowledging the value of the blink of an eye alongside rational analysis can lead to a different and better world. The lesson of the Getty Kouros is that scientific opinion is not always more objective than aesthetic judgment. As the curator Marion True eventually realized, in the face of the truth about the statue, she had been wrong to dismiss the power of the glance. Chapter 1. The theory of thin slices. How a little bit of knowledge goes a long way. Some years ago, a young couple, whom we shall call Bill and Susan, visited the laboratory of psychologist John Gottman at the University of Washington. They were in their 20s, attractive, intelligent, and funny. To the casual observer, they seemed like the kind of couple that is easy to like. Bill with his playful manner and Susan with her sharp, deadpan wit. They were led into a small room, sat in office chairs about 5 feet apart, and hooked up to electrodes and sensors that measured their heart rate, sweat, and skin temperature. Cameras recorded their every move. For 15 minutes, they were instructed to discuss a point of contention in their marriage. For Bill and Susan, the issue was their dog. Bill didn't like the new puppy. Susan did. They talked about it. They didn't scream or yell. They bantered. At one point, they even joked about whether the dog smelled oily. "I've never let my dog get oily," Susan said playfully. "You'd better be careful." "No, you'd better be careful," Bill replied. It seemed like a perfectly ordinary, even affectionate conversation. 1. The Love Lab. If you were to watch that 15-minute tape, could you tell if Bill and Susan's marriage was destined to last? Most of us would say no. 15 minutes of chatting about a dog seems far too short and trivial to reveal the deep truths of a relationship. Marriages are complex, shaped by money, sex, children, jobs, and in-laws. To truly understand a couple, we assume we need to see them over months, in times of stress and times of joy. We believe that accurate prediction requires a mountain of information gathered over a long period. John Gottman has proven otherwise. Since the 1980s, he has brought thousands of couples into his Love Lab, videotaped them, and analyzed the results with a system he calls SPF, specific affect. This system codes every second of interaction into one of 20 separate emotional categories, such as disgust, anger, defensiveness, whining, or neutrality. When combined with data from the physical senses, heart rate, temperature, jiggling, Gottman can translate a conversation into a mathematical equation. The results are startling. If Gottman analyzes just 1 hour of a husband and wife talking, he can predict with 95% accuracy whether they will still be married 15 years later. If he watches for 15 minutes, his success rate is around 90%. Even more incredibly, one of his researchers found that viewing just 3 minutes of a couple talking allowed for highly accurate predictions about the future of their marriage. The truth of a relationship can be understood in a much shorter time than we ever imagined. Gottman is a man of science, relying on rigorous analysis and data. He does not make snap judgments. He sits with a computer and codes video frames. Yet his work teaches a profound lesson about the phenomenon of thin slicing. Thin slicing is the ability of our unconscious to find patterns in situations and behavior based on very narrow slices of experience. When the art expert Evelyn Harrison looked at the Getty Kouros and knew instantly it was wrong, she was thin slicing. When the Iowa gamblers began to avoid the red decks before they knew why, they were thin slicing. Our unconscious is able to do in a split second what Gottman does with his equations. It identifies the signature pattern of a complex situation. 2. Marriage and Morse code. When a trained observer looks at the tape of Bill and Susan, a different picture emerges. The conversation may seem polite, but the coding reveals hidden currents. Bill was defensive for a significant portion of the time. When he said, "Yeah, I know," it wasn't agreement. It was a yes-but tactic. Susan, for her part, rolled her eyes, a classic sign of contempt. She never once gave him credit or validated his feelings. The ratio of positive to negative emotion, which Gottman has found must be at least 5-to-1 for a marriage to survive, was skewed. Gottman argues that every marriage has a distinctive pattern, a kind of marital DNA, or fist. The term fist comes from the world of Morse code. In World War II, British interceptors learned to identify individual German radio operators not by the content of their messages, but by the unique rhythm and style, the fist, with which they tapped out the dots and dashes. No two operators sent code exactly the same way. The pattern was stable and unique. Relationships are the same. They have a signature that arises naturally and automatically. This explains why we can predict divorce by watching a couple for just a few minutes. We aren't looking at a random slice of time. We are looking at a hologram of the relationship. The pattern of how a couple interacts, whether they are in a state of positive sentiment override, where they give each other the benefit of the doubt, or negative sentiment override, where everything is interpreted as an attack, is present in every interaction. Predicting the future of a marriage is simply a matter of pattern recognition. 3. The importance of contempt. Determining the health of a marriage might seem like an overwhelming task. requiring the tracking of complex emotions and interactions. But Gottman has discovered a way to simplify the process. He has found that you don't need to pay attention to everything. You can find out much of what you need to know by focusing on 4 specific negative behaviors, which he calls the 4 horsemen: defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and contempt. Of these, contempt is by far the most important. Contempt is different from criticism. Criticism is an attack on character. You never listen, which invites defensiveness. Contempt is an act of superiority. It is speaking from a higher plane. It is an insult. You're a bitch. It is hierarchical. Gottman has found that the presence of contempt in a marriage is the single most important sign that the relationship is in trouble. It is so toxic that it even predicts physical illness. Having a partner who treats you with contempt stresses the immune system. This is how our unconscious works. It doesn't weigh every single piece of information. It sifts through the data, discards what is irrelevant, and zeroes in on the critical factors, like contempt. By finding the one thing that matters most, thin slicing can deliver an answer that is often better and more accurate than a judgment made after endless deliberation. 4. The secrets of the bedroom. Consider a different scenario. Imagine you need to judge someone's personality, say, for a job. You have 2 options. You can meet with the person twice a week for a year, getting to know them intimately, or you can spend 15 minutes in their bedroom when they are not there. Which method yields a more accurate picture? Common sense suggests the first option, but psychologist Samuel Gosling has shown that the second option, the thin slice, can be surprisingly effective. Gosling conducted a study where he had strangers assess college students' personalities simply by looking at their dorm rooms for 15 minutes. He then compared these assessments to the students' self-ratings and the ratings of their close friends. The results were striking. Friends were better at judging extroversion and agreeableness, traits that require interaction. But the strangers who had never met the students were more accurate at rating conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness to new experiences. How is this possible? A bedroom contains 3 kinds of clues: identity claims, frame degrees, awards, behavioral residue, dirty laundry, alphabetized CDs, and thought and feeling regulators, scented candles, decorative pillows. These items convey information that is often more honest and revealing than what a person might say in a conversation. In a face-to-face meeting, we can be distracted by a person's charm or our own stereotypes. We might assume a large football player is not intellectual or a friendly person is organized, but a room doesn't lie. It presents the evidence without the confusing noise of interaction. Just as Gottman finds the truth of a marriage in the subtle signals of contempt, we can find the truth of a personality in the silent testimony of a private space. 5. Listening to doctors. The power of thin slicing extends to high-stakes fields like medicine. Imagine trying to predict which doctors are most likely to be sued for malpractice. You might think the answer lies in analyzing their medical records, their training, or the number of errors they make. But the risk of being sued has surprisingly little to do with the quality of medical care. Plenty of doctors make mistakes and are never sued, while highly skilled surgeons get sued often. The difference lies in how patients are treated. People do not sue doctors they like. Malpractice suits are often expressions of anger about bad relationships. Patients sue when they feel rushed, ignored, or treated with disrespect. Medical researcher Wendy Levinson recorded conversations between doctors and patients. She found clear differences between those who had been sued and those who hadn't. The doctors who had never been sued spent a few minutes longer with patients, used more orienting comments, "First I'll examine you, then we'll talk," and engaged in active listening. They didn't necessarily provide more medical information, but they established a human connection. Psychologist Nalini Ambady took this further. She took Levinson's tapes and isolated just 40 seconds of the doctor speaking. She then content-filtered the audio, removing high-frequency sounds so that words were unintelligible, leaving only the tone, pitch, and rhythm. She played these garbled clips to judges who knew nothing about the doctors. Based solely on tone of voice, the judges could predict with significant accuracy who had been sued. Doctors with a dominant, hostile tone were in the sued group. Those with a warm, concerned tone were not. An issue as complex as medical malpractice could be boiled down to a thin slice of behavior, the sound of a voice. If a doctor talks down to you, your unconscious picks up on it instantly. That feeling, that lack of respect, is the seed of a lawsuit. 6. The power of the glance. Thin slicing is not a magic trick. It is a central part of being human. We do it whenever we meet a new person or confront a complex situation under stress. We rely on it because there are patterns, fists, everywhere, and our brains are designed to recognize them. Different professions have different names for this gift. In basketball, it is court sense, the ability to see everything happening at once. In the military, it is coup d'oeil, the power of the glance, allowing a general to instantly understand a battlefield. Birdwatchers call it the geese, the essence of a bird that allows for identification in a split second, long before specific details like feather color can be analyzed. Hollywood producer Brian Grazer felt it when he first met Tom Hanks. Hanks was reading for the movie Splash. He wasn't the funniest actor Grazer had seen, but in that instant, Grazer saw something special. He saw a man who could be mean and still be forgiven, a man with whom the audience would want to connect. Grazer cast him, and later cast him as an astronaut in Apollo 13 despite doubts from others. He knew the world would want to see Tom Hanks survive. He had thin-sliced Hanks's likability. If we couldn't thin-slice, the world would be a chaotic, confusing place. We wouldn't understand the drama of a movie, the flow of a game, or the truth of a relationship. We are experts at this. We just need to understand that the glance can be as powerful as the long, hard look. Chapter 2. The Locked Door. The Secret Life of Snap Decisions. Vic Braden, one of the world's top tennis coaches, can predict a double fault before it happens. He doesn't know how he does it, he just knows. He'll be watching a match, and as the player tosses the ball, Braden will blurt out, "Oh no, double fault." And it happens. He isn't calling 50-50 coin tosses. Double faults are rare in professional tennis. Yet in one tournament at Indian Wells, he correctly called 16 out of 17 double faults. He was terrified by his own ability. He would lie in bed at night trying to figure out what he was seeing. Was it the toss? The footwork? The backswing? He couldn't find the answer. He knew something, but he didn't know what he knew. This is the central mystery of the snap judgment. It happens behind a locked door. We can't simply look inside our minds and see how we came to a conclusion. The decision-making process is rapid and unconscious. When the Iowa gamblers started sweating before picking from the bad decks, they didn't know why. When the art experts felt intuitive repulsion at the sight of the churros, they couldn't immediately articulate the problem. We live in a society that values evidence and articulation. We trust the decision that can be explained. If a CEO like Jack Welch makes a gut decision, he usually backs it up with a rational theory later. But as Braden's experience shows, it is possible to know something profound without being able to say how you know it. The challenge is acknowledging that sometimes the best thinking happens outside the reach of our conscious awareness. 1. Primed for action. To understand what happens behind that locked door, consider a scrambled sentence test devised by psychologist John Bargh. Imagine you are given a list of words like worried, Florida, old, lonely, grey, and bingo, and asked to form sentences. The test seems harmless. But researchers found that after completing this test, people walked down the hallway more slowly than those who hadn't taken it. Why? Because the words Florida, old, and grey primed their adaptive unconscious with the concept of age. They weren't thinking about being old consciously, but their unconscious mind picked up the pattern and directed their bodies to act accordingly. They literally started walking like old people. This phenomenon is called priming, and its effects can be startling. In another experiment, Bargh primed students with words related to rudeness, like aggressively, bother, disturb, or politeness, respect, considerate, yield. He then instructed them to walk down the hall to talk to a professor who was intentionally stuck in a long conversation with someone else. The students primed to be rude interrupted the conversation after about 5 minutes. But 82% of the students primed to be polite never interrupted at all. They just stood there for 10 minutes until the experiment was called off. The implications are unsettling. We like to think of ourselves as agents of free will, in complete control of our actions. But these experiments suggest that much of our behavior is driven by automatic pilots triggered by our environment. 2 Dutch researchers found that asking students to think about professors before a game of Trivial Pursuit raised their scores, while asking them to think about soccer hooligans lowered them. The students didn't become smarter or stupider. They were simply primed to be in a smart or dumb frame of mind. This unconscious guidance system is actually a survival mechanism. It acts like a mental valet, taking care of minor details and social cues so our conscious mind can focus on bigger tasks. However, When this system is damaged, the results are catastrophic. Neurologist Antonio Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a brain area critical for decision-making. These patients retained their intelligence but lost their judgment. They could endlessly analyze the pros and cons of a simple appointment date but couldn't make a decision. In the gambling experiment, they never developed the sweaty palms or the gut feeling to avoid the red decks. They lacked the valet that nudges us toward the right choice. In fast-moving situations, we need that valet. We need the locked door. 2. The storytelling problem. The locked door protects our snap judgments, but it also creates a problem. We can't explain them. And when we try to, we often make things up. Consider speed dating. In a Manhattan bar, young professionals rotated from table to table, spending 6 minutes with each potential date. They made snap judgments about whom they liked instantly. But when psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Raymond Fisman asked these daters to explain their choices, things got messy. Mary, for example, might say before the event that she wants a man who is intelligent and sincere. But during the event, she might fall for John, who is funny and attractive but not particularly smart. When asked the next day to describe her ideal man, she might adjust her criteria to match John. A month later, she might revert to her original list. Her conscious theory of what she wants doesn't match her unconscious preferences in the moment. She has a storytelling problem. We see this in sports as well. Ted Williams, the legendary baseball player, could describe exactly how he watched the ball hit the bat. But science tells us that the ball moves too fast for the human eye to track it that closely. Williams was a genius hitter, but his explanation of his own genius was a fabrication. He was making up a story to explain an unconscious feat. The psychologist Norman R. F. Meyer demonstrated this with a classic experiment involving 2 ropes hanging from a ceiling, far enough apart that a person couldn't reach both at once. The subjects were asked to tie the ropes together. There were several solutions, but the most difficult one involved swinging one rope like a pendulum. Most people were stumped. Meyer would then casually brush against one rope, setting it swinging. Immediately, the subjects would have an aha moment and solve the puzzle. But when asked how they figured it out, they gave elaborate, incorrect explanations. One professor said he thought of monkeys swinging in trees. They weren't lying, they genuinely didn't know that Meyer's hint had triggered the solution. Their unconscious mind picked up the clue, but their conscious mind invented a story to explain the insight. This is the danger of demanding explanations for snap judgments. When we ask people why regarding their intuitive decisions, we force them to fabricate answers that may have nothing to do with the truth. We need to accept that sometimes we simply know, and that asking for the logic behind the knowing can destroy the insight itself. Chapter 3. The Warren Harding Error. Why we fall for tall, dark, and handsome men. In the back garden of the Globe Hotel in Richwood, Ohio, early one morning in 1899, 2 men met while getting their shoes shined. One was Harry Doherty, a lawyer and lobbyist who was the Machiavelli of Ohio politics, a shrewd, red-faced man who knew how to pull the strings of power. The other was Warren Harding, a newspaper editor from the small town of Marion, who was about to win a seat in the state senate. Doherty looked at Harding and was instantly overwhelmed. Harding was magnificent. He was 35 years old with a massive head and features that commanded attention. He had the kind of bronzed complexion and heavy black hair that gave him a rugged, almost Roman handsomeness. His voice was resonant and masculine, his manner warm and courteous. As he tipped the bootblack, he radiated a genuine good-natured kindness. In that moment, a thought struck Doherty that would change American history. Wouldn't that man make a great president? The truth was that Warren Harding was not a particularly smart man. He loved poker, golf, and whiskey, and his sexual appetites were legendary. As he climbed the political ladder, he never distinguished himself. His speeches were bloviating armies of phrases searching for an idea. In the Senate, he was absent for the critical debates on women's suffrage and prohibition. He advanced solely because he was pushed by his wife and stage-managed by Doherty, and because, as he aged, he looked more and more like a statesman. He could wear a toga and play Julius Caesar. He looked like a senator. He looked like a leader. By 1920, Doherty had convinced Harding to run for the White House. At the Republican convention, Harding was an also-ran, 6th in a field of 6. But the convention deadlocked. In the smoke-filled rooms of the Blackstone Hotel, the party bosses threw up their hands. They needed a candidate everyone could agree on. One name surfaced instantly: Harding. He looked like a president, so he became the nominee and then the president. He served 2 years before dying of a stroke and is widely regarded as one of the worst presidents in American history. 3. The dark side of thin slicing. This story illustrates the dark side of rapid cognition. Until now, we have celebrated the power of thin slicing, the ability of art experts to spot a fake chorus in a glance, or of a psychologist to predict divorce in 3 minutes. These judgments succeed because they cut through the noise to find the truth. But what happens when that rapid processing is interrupted? What if our unconscious relies on the wrong cues? We have powerful associations with appearance. Just as the word Florida can prime us to walk slowly, a person's physical presence, their height, their build, their race, can trigger a cascade of assumptions. When voters looked at Warren Harding, they didn't see a man of limited intellect and vague principles. They saw his silver hair and his bronzed skin and instantly assumed he possessed courage, intelligence, and integrity. They stopped thinking. They didn't dig below the surface. This is the Warren Harding error, when our instincts betray us, leading to prejudice, discrimination, and the elevation of mediocrity. 4. Blink. In black and white, psychologists have developed a tool to measure these hidden associations called the Implicit Association Test, or IAT. It is based on a simple observation. We make connections much faster between ideas that are already related in our minds. If we are asked to categorize names into male or female, we are fast because the associations are obvious. John is male, Lisa is female. But the test gets complicated when we mix categories. Imagine trying to sort words into 2 columns. On the left is male or career, on the right is female or family. Most people find this easy. We are culturally conditioned to link men with work and women with the home. But if the categories are flipped, male or family versus female or career, we slow down. The brain stumbles. It takes a fraction of a second longer to process entrepreneur when it must be placed in the female column. That delay is a measurement of our unconscious bias. The most famous version is the race IAT. The test asks you to categorize faces as African American or European American, while simultaneously categorizing words as good or bad. When European American is paired with good, most people fly through the test. But when African American is paired with good, the reaction time's slow. This happens even to people who consciously believe in racial equality. It happens to African Americans themselves. It is a humbling, even creeping feeling to sit at a computer and watch your own mind struggle to associate peace or wonderful with a black face as quickly as with a white one. This does not necessarily mean we are racists in the conscious, hateful sense. It means we live in a culture that constantly bombards us with messages linking whiteness with the positive and blackness with the negative. Our adaptive unconscious absorbs this data silently, but these implicit associations have real-world consequences. If you have a pro-white bias on the IAT, you might act differently in a job interview with a black applicant. You might sit further away, make less eye contact, or smile less. You won't realize you are doing it, but the applicant will feel the distance and perhaps perform poorly. A snap judgment based on a hidden bias can sabotage the interaction before it even begins. This extends to height. In the US population, only about 14.5% of men are 6 feet or taller. Yet among CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that number is 58%. We have an unconscious stereotype that leaders are tall. We see a tall man and we swoon, assuming competence and authority, just as voters did with Harding. An inch of height is worth nearly $800 in salary per year. We are not as rational as we think. We privilege the tall, the attractive, and the white, often without ever deciding to do so. 5. Taking care of the customer. Bob Gollum is the sales director of a Nissan dealership in Flemington, New Jersey. He is a virtuoso of the car sales, selling more than double the average. He is successful because he thin slices effortlessly, reading a customer's needs and emotions instantly. But his true secret is that he consciously fights the Warren Harding error. He has a simple rule: never judge a customer by their appearance. Salespeople often prejudge. They see a teenager or a man in dirty coveralls and assume they can't afford a car. They blow them off. Gollum knows that the farmer in the coveralls might be a wealthy landowner paying cash. He knows the teenager might return with his parents to buy a car that evening. Prejudging is the kiss of death, he says. He treats everyone who walks in the door with the exact same level of respect and attention. He edits out the physical clues that lead others astray and focuses only on what matters, the customer's behavior and intent. 6. Spotting the sucker. Why is Golom's approach so rare? Because the car business is rife with the Warren Harding error. A study by law professor Ian Ayres sent 38 people to car dealerships in Chicago. They were all young, attractive, dressed professionally, and gave the exact same script. The only difference was their race and gender. The results were stunning. White men were offered an initial price of $725 above the dealer's invoice. White women got an offer of $935 above. Black women were quoted $1,195 above. And black men? They were hit with an initial offer of $1,687 above invoice. Even after 40 minutes of bargaining, black men ended up with a price nearly $800 higher than white men. The salesmen were unconsciously thin-slicing these customers as suckers or laydowns, people who would pay the sticker price simply because they were women or black. Despite the fact that these buyers were clearly educated and professional, the salesmen couldn't get past their initial biased snap judgment. They saw a black man and thought gullible, costing themselves sales and alienating potential customers. 7. Think about Dr. King. The Warren Harding error paints a bleak picture of our unconscious. If these biases are buried so deep, how can we fix them? We can't simply pass a law against unconscious discrimination, but we are not helpless. Our first impressions are generated by our experiences and our environment. If we change our environment, we can change our impressions. Research shows that if you show people pictures of admired African Americans, like Martin Luther King Jr., Colin Powell, or Nelson Mandela before they take the IAT, their reaction times change, the bias shrinks. We can alter the way we thin slice. If we want to be fair, we have to actively expose ourselves to positive examples of the groups we might unconsciously stereotype. We have to curate our own experiences. We can teach our adaptive unconscious to be better. We can lock the door on the Warren Harding error, but only if we are willing to take active steps to manage the impressions that flood our minds. Chapter 4. Paul Van Riper's Big Victory, Creating Structure for Spontaneity. Paul Van Riper is a man of imposing physical and mental stature, a Marine Corps veteran who moves with the square-shouldered confidence of a lifelong soldier. His career was forged in the jungles of Vietnam, where he learned the brutal realities of combat not from a manual, but from the chaotic, unpredictable nature of war itself. He was a commander who led from the front, a gunslinger who believed that once the shooting started, the time for rational analysis was over. In the heat of battle, he understood that hesitation was fatal and that order was often an illusion. In the spring of 2000, the Pentagon approached the retired Van Riper with a proposition. They were preparing for the largest, most expensive war game in history, known as Millennium Challenge 02. The scenario involved a rogue military commander in the Persian Gulf who was threatening regional stability. The US military, representing the blue team, would bring its full technological might to bear against this enemy. Van Riper was asked to play the opposing commander of the red team. It was a casting choice that would expose a fundamental rift in military philosophy and offer a profound lesson on the nature of decision-making. 1. One morning in the Gulf. The Joint Forces Command, JFCOM, ran the exercise from a nondescript building in Suffolk, Virginia. For the Pentagon, Millennium Challenge was more than a game. It was a validation of a new doctrine. The blue team was equipped with the Operational Net Assessment, a sophisticated decision-making tool designed to break the enemy down into a series of interconnected systems: military, economic, social, and political. They believed that with enough data, satellites, and sensors, they could lift the fog of war. They could see everything, know everything, and predict their enemy's every move. They entered the virtual battlefield with a sense of invincibility, armed with matrices and acronyms that promised total situational awareness. Van Riper, sitting in the Red Team command post, viewed this technological hubris with skepticism. He knew that war is inherently messy and non-linear. When the Blue Team cut his fiber optic lines and microwave towers, expecting to force him onto easily monitored cell phones, he surprised them. He used motorcycle couriers to deliver messages and coded signals hidden in prayers. When they expected him to use radar that they could track, he used lighting systems from World War II to launch his aircraft. Then came the defining moment. The Blue Team fleet steamed into the Persian Gulf, confident in their preemptive strategy and their ability to deflect any conventional attack. Van Riper didn't wait to be dismantled. He struck first. He unleashed a swarm of small boats and fired a massive barrage of cruise missiles at the American fleet. The blue team's computer models, overwhelmed by the sheer volume and unconventional nature of the attack, registered catastrophic hits. In an instant, 16 American ships, including an aircraft carrier, were sunk. 20,000 virtual sailors were dead. The rogue commander had exploited the hubris of a system that believed it had solved the riddle of war. 2. The structure of spontaneity. To understand how Van Riper dismantled a superior force, one must look to an unlikely source: improvisation comedy. Consider the comedy troupe Mother, performing in a basement theater in Manhattan. They take the stage with no script, no plot, and no idea what character they will play. Yet they manage to create a cohesive, funny, and riveting 30-minute play on the spot. To the audience, it looks like magic, a feat of pure, unbridled spontaneity. But improv is not chaotic, it is highly disciplined. The actors practice religiously, not to rehearse lines, but to rehearse the rules of interaction. The most important of these is the rule of agreement, or saying yes. If one actor says, "I'm having trouble with my leg," and the other says, "Your leg looks fine," the scene dies, the reality has been rejected. But if the second actor says, "I see that, it looks like woodworm," the scene explodes with possibility. They accept the premise and build on it. Spontaneity isn't random, it occurs within a structure. This was Van Riper's secret. He didn't micromanage his red team. He didn't demand long meetings to analyze the blue dime versus the red PMAC. He gave his commander's intent, a broad guidance of what he wanted to achieve, and then let them figure out how to do it. He created a condition of command and out of control. By removing the shackles of centralized processing, he allowed his forces to react instantly to the shifting reality of the battlefield. He gave them the structure they needed to be spontaneous. 3. The perils of introspection. There is a danger in thinking too much. During his tours in Vietnam, Van Riper learned that demanding explanations from troops in the midst of a firefight was counterproductive. Asking "what is going on" forced them to detach from the immediate reality to construct a narrative, often delaying action and distorting the truth. Psychologist Jonathan Schooler calls this verbal overshadowing. In experiments where subjects are asked to describe a face they have just seen, their ability to recognize that face later actually diminishes. The act of forcing a nonverbal, instinctive perception into words engages the left hemisphere of the brain, overriding the right hemisphere's visual memory. We lose the image by trying to explain it. The same peril applies to insight. When people are asked to explain their thought process while solving a logic puzzle, their success rate drops. Insight is a fragile, flickering candle that is easily snuffed out by the heavy boot of introspection. The blue team failed because they were trapped in a cycle of analysis. They were busy filling out matrices and discussing political implications while the red team was firing missiles. By forcing their commanders to stop, talk, and explain, the blue team destroyed their ability to thin slice the battlefield. They valued the explanation of the decision more than the decision itself. 4. A crisis in the ER. Brendan Riley faced a similar battle between intuition and analysis at Cook County Hospital in Chicago. As the chairman of the Department of Medicine, he inherited a legendary but crumbling institution. The hospital was the place of last resort for the city's uninsured, and its emergency department was besieged. The most resource-intensive patients were those complaining of chest pain. Diagnosing a heart attack is notoriously difficult. Doctors would gather mountains of data, risk factors, age, medical history, the nature of the pain, and then, faced with uncertainty and the fear of malpractice, they would admit the patient to the coronary care unit just to be safe. The result was a hospital overflowing with healthy people occupying expensive beds, while genuinely sick patients waited in the halls. The doctors believed that more information led to better decisions, but their accuracy remained poor. Riley turned to a radical solution proposed by cardiologist Lee Goldman. Goldman had developed a decision tree, a mathematical algorithm that ignored most of the information doctors traditionally gathered. It focused on just 3 urgent risk factors and the ECG reading. It didn't ask about diabetes or smoking habits or age. It asked only what was happening right now. Riley pitted the doctor's judgment against the algorithm. For 2 years, they ran a bake-off. The result was decisive. The algorithm was 70% better at recognizing patients who were not having heart attacks and significantly safer for those who were. By ignoring the extra data, the algorithm found the truth that the doctors, drowning in information, had missed. 5. When less is more. the lesson of the Cook County ER is the same as the lesson of the Persian Gulf. In high-stakes, time-pressured situations, less information is often more. We assume that to make a good decision, we need to know everything. We want the full dossier, the complete background check, the satellite imagery. But as the blue team discovered, too much information becomes a burden. It creates a thick slice that obscures the thin slice of truth. The Goldman algorithm worked because it was frugal. It edited out the noise. A patient's age and weight are important for long-term health, but they are distractions when trying to determine if a heart attack is happening this very second. The blue team, with its 40,000 entry database, could not edit. They were paralyzed by the sheer volume of their own intelligence. Van Riper, by contrast, kept his information channels lean. He looked for the forecast, not the barometric pressure. To be a successful decision-maker, one must protect the ability to edit. When we are forced to consider too many options or justify every hunch, our rapid cognition shuts down. Van Riper protected his team's instincts by refusing to clutter their minds with the blue team's mechanistic processes. He understood that you cannot rationalize your way through a knife fight. 6. Millennium Challenge, Part 2. The story of Millennium Challenge has a troubling postscript. After the Red Team's devastating victory, the war game was paused. The dead American troops were resurrected and the sunken ships were refloated. The Pentagon leadership directed the game administrators to script the rest of the exercise. Van Riper was given a new set of orders. He was told to turn on his radar so the blue team could see him. He was forbidden from shooting down the blue team's aircraft. He was forced to move his troops into the open so they could be destroyed. The unpredictability that Van Riper had injected into the game, the very element that made it a realistic test of war, was systematically removed. The rest of the exercise proceeded as a scripted rout. The blue team triumphed, their theories validated by a rigged game. The analysts congratulated themselves on lifting the fog of war, ignoring the fact that they had only achieved clarity by eliminating the enemy's free will. They chose to validate their comfortable theory rather than learn from the uncomfortable reality of their defeat. They turned a blind eye to the power of rapid cognition and the structure of spontaneity, preferring instead the safety of their matrices and the illusion of control. Chapter 5. Kenner's Dilemma, the Right and Wrong. Way to ask people what they want. The musician known as Kenner grew up in Virginia Beach, raised by Ethiopian immigrants who instilled in him a drive for success. His childhood soundtrack was CNN and Kenny Rogers, chosen by his father for its clear lessons on life and money. It wasn't until a neighbor introduced him to U2's The Joshua Tree that Kenner realized music could be something else entirely. It opened a door. He taught himself piano, studied the vocal stylings of Stevie Wonder, and began to craft a sound that was notoriously difficult to classify, a soulful, ethereal blend of British new wave and hip-hop. By the time he was an adult, Kenner had attracted the attention of some of the most influential ears in the music industry. Craig Kallman, the co-president of Atlantic Records and a man with a personal collection of 200,000 records, heard a demo and was instantly mesmerized. Fred Durst, of the band Limp Bizkit, heard a track over the phone and demanded he be signed. Paul McGuinness, the legendary manager of U2, flew Kenner to Ireland, convinced he was looking at an artist who would change the world. When Kenner opened for the band No Doubt, the crowd, initially indifferent, ended up chanting for him. The experts, the people who lived and breathed music, knew instantly that Kenner was a star. But Kenner had a problem. To succeed in the modern music business, an artist needs radio play, and to get radio play, the music must pass the scrutiny of market research. When Kenner's album was sent to the testing firms, who played snippets for random listeners over the phone and the web, the results were disastrous. The listeners didn't get it. The scores were low. The thin slicing of the general public completely contradicted the thin slicing of the experts. The industry insiders were paralyzed. They loved him, but the data said he was a failure. 1. A second look at first impressions. To understand Kenner's predicament, we must look at the rise of market research in other fields. In the 1970s, the political consultant Dick Morris met with a young Bill Clinton in Arkansas. Morris introduced Clinton to a concept borrowed from the film industry. Before releasing a movie, studios would read plot summaries to audiences to gauge their interest. Morris argued that politics should be the same. Why guess what voters want when you can ask them? They could test speeches, slogans, and policy positions, refining their message based on direct feedback. Clinton was fascinated. This approach promised to turn the chaotic art of politics into a science. It treated the voter like a consumer and the candidate like a product. This philosophy has come to dominate our world. We assume that the best way to find out what people feel is to ask them directly. If we want to know if a song is good, we play it for people and ask them to rate it. But the lessons of previous chapters suggest a flaw in this logic. We know that the adaptive unconscious operates behind a locked door. When the Iowa gamblers avoided the red decks, they couldn't explain why. When students were primed to be rude or polite, they had no idea their behavior had been manipulated. If we ask people to explain their instincts, they often fabricate answers or become confused. The question is, can we trust what people tell us about their first impressions? 2. Pepsi's challenge. In the early 1980s, Coca-Cola faced a crisis. Its historic rival Pepsi was gaining ground. Internally, Coke executives were panicked by the Pepsi challenge, a blind taste test in which consumers were given 2 unmarked cups, one Coke, one Pepsi, and asked which they preferred. Overwhelmingly, people chose Pepsi. Fearing their product was inferior, Coke executives reformulated their soda to be lighter and sweeter, more like Pepsi. They called it New Coke. In taste tests, New Coke beat the original formula, and it beat Pepsi. It seemed like a guaranteed success. Yet when New Coke launched, it was a disaster. The public revolted. They hated it. The company was forced to bring back the original formula within months. Why did the market research fail so spectacularly? The answer lies in the nature of the test. The Pepsi challenge was a sip test. In a sip test, tasters take a single swallow. In that setting, the sweeter product almost always wins because sweetness provides a quick burst of energy and pleasure. But no one drinks a single sip of soda at home. They drink a whole can. Over the course of a whole can, the intense sweetness of Pepsi can become cloying, while the sharper bite of Coke becomes more appealing. The thin slice of the sip test was not representative of the real experience. 3. The blind. Leading the blind. There was a second flaw in the Pepsi challenge. It was blind. In the real world, we never consume products in a vacuum. We drink the brand, the can, the logo, and the history as much as the liquid. In the 1940s, a marketing expert named Louis Cheskin demonstrated this phenomenon known as sensation transference. He showed that people's perception of a product's quality is often transferred unconsciously from the packaging. In one experiment, he found that adding a crest to a brandy bottle improved the perceived taste of the brandy. In another, he changed the color of a margarine container and found that people claimed the margarine tasted better. Coca-Cola's mistake was believing that the product could be separated from the brand. By focusing entirely on the liquid in a blind test, they ignored the immense emotional weight of the Coca-Cola imagery. When people drank New Coke from a can with the new logo, they weren't just reacting to the sweetness, they were reacting to the loss of a cultural icon. Market research that strips away context, like a blind taste test or a snippet of a song played over the phone, often destroys the very first impression it seeks to measure. 4. The chair of death. In the early 1990s, the furniture company Herman Miller asked designer Bill Stumpf to create a new office chair. Stumpf wanted to move beyond the traditional cushioned executive throne. He designed a chair called the Aeron. It was radical. It had no cushions. Instead, it used a mesh fabric stretched over a plastic frame. It looked like the exoskeleton of a giant prehistoric insect. When Herman Miller tested the chair with focus groups, the reaction was brutal. People looked at it and rated it as uncomfortable before they even sat in it. When they did sit in it, they rated it as comfortable, but they still hated the way it looked. They called it the chair of death. It was weird, it was ugly, it didn't look like a chair. The company faced a dilemma. The market research scores were terrible. Conventional wisdom said they should scrap the design, but they decided to trust Stumpf's vision instead. They released the chair. At first, it sold poorly, but then it began to appear in design magazines. It won awards. The tech industry adopted it. Soon, the Aeron became the best-selling chair in the history of the company. The problem with the focus groups was that they couldn't distinguish between ugly and different. The Aeron was so new that consumers had no frame of reference for it. Their immediate unconscious reaction was rejection because it violated their expectations of what a chair should be. Market research is excellent for tweaking known products, but it is often incapable of evaluating truly innovative ideas. If you ask people what they want, they will usually look for something familiar. 5. The gift of expertise. Is there a way to get reliable feedback on the new and the strange? Yes, but you have to ask the right people. Gail Vance Seville and Judy Haleman are professional food tasters. They can take a bite of mayonnaise or a sip of coffee and break it down into dozens of precise sensory dimensions. They don't just say, "I like it." They say, "It has a grassy note, a hint of oxidization, and a viscosity of 4 on a 15-point scale." Experts like Seville and Haleman don't suffer from the storytelling problem that plagues laypeople. When a novice is asked to explain why they like a particular jam, they get confused. They grasp for plausible reasons, it has chunks, and often end up changing their preference to match their explanation. This is why the students in the jam experiment, mentioned in earlier chapters, drifted away from the expert consensus when asked to articulate their reasoning. Experts, however, have a vocabulary for their instincts. Their thin slicing is grounded in years of training. They can explain their reactions without losing touch with their actual experience. If Herman Miller had asked designers to evaluate the Aeron, they might have seen the genius that the focus groups missed. 6. It sucks what the record companies are doing to you. This brings us back to Kenner. The reason Kenner failed in market research wasn't that his music was bad, it was that his music was the Aeron chair. It was new. It didn't fit the established categories of rock or R&B. When people heard a grainy, low-quality snippet of his song over the phone, they couldn't process it. They rejected it because it was unfamiliar. The music executives, however, were like the food experts. They had the training and the vocabulary to understand what Kenner was doing. They could hear the potential in the thin slice that the general public missed. The tragedy of Kenner's career is that the music industry surrendered its expertise to the flawed science of the focus group. They trusted the snap judgments of people who lacked the context and the vocabulary to judge the new, rather than trusting their own educated instincts. Kenner's dilemma teaches us that while we should respect the power of first impressions, we must also know when to be skeptical of them. When it comes to the new and the different, the public's instinct is often to turn away. It takes an expert or a leap of faith to see the potential in the chair of death or the artist who doesn't sound like anyone else. Chapter 6. 7 Seconds in the Bronx. The Delicate Art of Mind Reading. The 1100 block of Wheeler Avenue in the Soundview section of the South Bronx is a quiet stretch of modest brick row houses. It is a working-class neighborhood, often the first stop for immigrants seeking a foothold in New York City. In February 1999, Amadou Diallo lived there. Diallo was a 22-year-old street peddler from Guinea, a small, quiet man who sold socks and gloves in Manhattan. Just before midnight on February 3rd, Diallo returned to his building after a long day. He went inside, but then came back out to the stoop to get some fresh air. He stood there, alone, looking out at the street. Moments later, an unmarked Ford Taurus turned onto Wheeler Avenue. Inside were 4 plainclothes officers from the NYPD's elite street crime unit: Sean Carroll, Edward McMillan, Kenneth Boss, and Richard Murphy. They were patrolling for violent criminals in a high-crime area. As they drove past, Carroll spotted Diallo on the stoop. To Carroll, Diallo looked suspicious. He looked like a lookout. The car stopped and reversed. The officers got out. "Police!" McMillan called out. "Can we have a word?" Diallo didn't answer. He turned and retreated into the vestibule of his building. Carroll and McMillan followed him up the steps. Diallo reached into his pocket. Carroll yelled, "Gun!" What followed was a storm of violence that lasted only a few seconds. The officers opened fire. McMillan tripped backward off the steps, and seeing him fall, his partners assumed he had been shot. They intensified their fire. In the end, 41 bullets were fired. 19 struck Diallo. When the smoke cleared and the officers approached the body to secure the weapon, they found only a black wallet lying in Diallo's hand. There was no gun, there was no lookout. There was just a terrified young man dead in the vestibule of his own home. 3 fatal mistakes. The shooting of Amadou Diallo was a tragedy born of a catastrophic failure of rapid cognition. The officers made a series of snap judgments, and every single one of them was wrong. First, they saw a man standing on a stoop and judged him to be suspicious. The truth was, he was simply breathing the night air. That was the first mistake. Second, when they backed the car up, Diallo didn't run. To the officers, this lack of movement read as brazenness, the behavior of a hardened criminal who didn't fear the police. In reality, Diallo was just curious. He was wondering what this car was doing. That was the second mistake. Third, and most fatally, when Diallo reached for his pocket, the officers instinctively judged that he was reaching for a weapon. He was actually reaching for his wallet, perhaps to show ID. They read his action as aggression when it was likely an act of terrified compliance. That was the third mistake. We rely on our ability to read other people, to infer their intentions and emotions in a blink. We do it constantly. When a child looks at us, we know if they are happy or scared. When a stranger approaches, we instantly gauge if they are a threat. This mind reading is usually effortless and accurate. But on Wheeler Avenue, that fundamental human mechanism broke down completely. The officers looked at Diallo and saw a killer. They were looking at a mirror of their own fears, not the man in front of them. 2. The theory of mind reading. To understand how we read minds and how we fail, we must look to the human face. The face is not just a secondary billboard for our internal states, it is the primary canvas of emotion. Two psychologists, Sylvan Tompkins and Paul Ekman, revolutionized our understanding of this. Tompkins, a larger-than-life figure with a mane of white hair, believed that the face was the center of human emotional life. He argued that emotions are not vague, internal feelings, but specific physiological responses that are hardwired into our facial muscles. His student, Paul Ekman, set out to prove this. In the 1960s, the prevailing wisdom was that facial expressions were culturally determined, that a smile in America might mean something different in Japan. Ekman traveled to the highlands of Papua New Guinea to study a tribe that had almost no contact with the outside world. He told them stories. A man's child has died, and asked them to choose the face that matched the story. The results were definitive. The tribesmen picked the same faces for sadness, anger, happiness, and disgust that a college student in New York would pick. Facial expressions are universal. They are part of our evolutionary heritage. When we feel an emotion, our facial muscles contract in a predictable, involuntary way. This means that if we know what to look for, the face is a flawless map of the mind. We can read intention and feeling because they are written on the skin. 3. The naked face. Ekman and another colleague, Wallace Friesen, spent years mapping the human face. They identified every distinct muscular movement the face can make, 43 in all, and called them action units. They created the Facial Action Coding System, FACS, a taxonomy of human expression. They discovered that while we can control our expressions to some extent, we cannot control them completely. There is a difference between a polite, voluntary smile and a genuine, involuntary one. A genuine smile, the Duchenne smile, involves not just the corners of the mouth, Action Unit 12, but also the muscles around the eyes, Action Unit 6. We can fake the mouth, but we can't easily fake the eyes. Furthermore, emotions often leak out in micro-expressions, fleeting flashes of true feeling that last less than a fifth of a second. A liar might smile to cover his anxiety, but for a fraction of a second, a look of fear will dart across his face. These micro-expressions are the cracks in the armor. They allow us to see behind the social mask. If the officers on Wheeler Avenue had been able to read Diallo's face, they would have seen fear, confusion, and curiosity. They would not have seen the cold aggression of a cop killer, but they were blind to the signals. 4. A man, a woman, and a light switch. What happens when we lose the ability to mind read? The condition of autism offers a clue. People with autism are often described as mind blind. They cannot instinctively grasp what others are thinking or feeling. They struggle to interpret nonverbal cues. A psychologist named Ami Klin demonstrated this by tracking the eye movements of an autistic man named Peter while he watched the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? The movie is a study in intense, unspoken emotional conflict. A typical viewer watches the character's eyes to understand the shifting power dynamics and hidden agendas. Peter, however, did not look at the eyes. When a character pointed at something, Peter didn't look at the person pointing, he looked at the object. In a scene where a couple kissed passionately, Peter's eyes drifted to a light switch on the wall behind them. He sought comfort in the stability of inanimate objects, rather than the confusing chaos of human emotion. When we are under extreme stress, we can become temporarily autistic. We stop looking at the eyes, we stop reading the subtle nuances of the face, we retreat to a rigid, mechanical understanding of the world. We look for the light switch, the simple, obvious cue, and miss the complex human reality. 5. Arguing with a dog. The officers on Wheeler Avenue were in a state of extreme physiological arousal. Dave Grossman, an expert on the psychology of killing, and other researchers have charted what happens to the body during high-stress confrontations. When the heart rate rises above 115 beats per minute, fine motor skills begin to deteriorate. At 145 beats per minute, things get much worse. The body shuts down non-essential systems to focus on survival. We lose our peripheral vision, tunnel vision. We lose our depth perception. We lose the ability to process complex information. We become cognitively deficit. Above 175 beats per minute, we enter a state of breakdown. We can no longer think clearly. We might soil ourselves. We might exhibit irrational behavior. In this state, the brain reverts to its most primitive programming. The officers, jumping out of their car to confront a suspect in the dark, were almost certainly operating with heart rates well above 145. In that state, they were physically incapable of the subtle processing required to read Diallo's face or interpret his body language correctly. They saw a man, a hand, and a black object. Their brains, starved of the ability to process nuance, filled in the blanks with the most dangerous possibility: gun. 6. Running out of white space. Another factor destroyed the officer's judgment: a lack of time. Rapid cognition is fast, but it is not instantaneous. It requires a tiny window of time, white space, to process information. In the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan, the Secret Service agents had only 1.8 seconds to react. In that time frame, they couldn't think. They could only rely on rote training. They didn't see the shooter clearly or understand the situation until it was effectively over. Experiments by psychologist Keith Payne have shown that when people are forced to identify objects like a gun or a wrench in a split second, they rely heavily on stereotypes. If primed with a picture of a black face, people are far more likely to misidentify a wrench as a gun if they are under extreme time pressure. When given enough time, the error rate disappears. The officers on Wheeler Avenue rushed the situation. They backed up, jumped out, and confronted Diallo immediately. They eliminated the white space. They created a situation where they had to make a life-or-death decision in milliseconds. By closing the distance so quickly, they robbed themselves of the time needed for their eyes and brains to communicate the truth, that the black object was a wallet, not a weapon. 7. Something in my mind just told me I didn't have to shoot yet. Contrast the Diallo shooting with an incident involving a different police officer. This officer, chasing an armed teenage gang member into a dark backyard, found himself face to face with the boy. The boy reached for his waistband and pulled out a gun. The officer had every right to shoot, but he didn't. He waited. He watched the gun come out, watched the boy turn, and watched the boy drop the gun. He thin-sliced the situation and realized, in a split second, that the boy was scared and giving up, not attacking. Why did this officer succeed where the others failed? He was a veteran. He had been in high-stress situations before. He knew how to manage his arousal. He had stress inoculation. He didn't panic. He kept his distance, preserving the white space that allowed him to see the boy's face and read his intention. He was able to see the person, not just the threat. 8. Tragedy on Wheeler Avenue. The tragedy of Amadou Diallo was not that the officers were monsters. It was that they were human beings placed in a situation that stripped them of their humanity. They were young, inexperienced, and terrified. They created a chaotic environment that pushed their heart rates into the danger zone and eliminated the time required to think. In that corridor of stress, they became mind-blind. They stopped seeing Amadou Diallo as a curious young man getting some air. They saw a threat. They saw a stereotype. They fell victim to the dark side of thin slicing, where prejudice and fear fill in the gaps left by blindness. They fired 41 shots, not because they were evil, but because they were in the grip of a temporary autism, unable to read the desperate signals of innocence right in front of their eyes. Conclusion: listening with your eyes. The lessons of Blink. For most of the 20th century, the world of classical music was a fortress of white male privilege. The great symphony orchestras of Europe and America, the Vienna Philharmonic, the Berlin Philharmonic, the New York Philharmonic, were almost exclusively male. The reason given was always the same. Women simply couldn't play like men. They lacked the lung power for the brass, the strength for the percussion, and the authority for the strings. Conductors, the ultimate arbiters of musical taste, were convinced that they could hear the difference. They believed their thin slicing of a musician's ability was pure and objective, but they were wrong. They weren't just listening to the music. They were watching the musician, and their eyes were corrupting their ears. They were falling victim to the same trap that caught the voters for Warren Harding and the car salesman in Chicago. They saw a woman and unconsciously adjusted their expectations downward. The music sounded weaker because they expected it to be weak. 1. A revolution in classical music. The revolution began quietly in the 1970s, driven not by a lawsuit or a protest, but by a simple piece of furniture, a screen. Orchestras began to hold blind auditions. The candidate would play behind a partition, invisible to the jury. To further ensure anonymity, carpets were laid down to muffle the distinctive click of women's heels. The judges were left with nothing but the sound. The results were immediate and shocking. When the visual bias was removed, women started winning. In the United States, the number of women in top orchestras increased fivefold. The screen revealed that the masculine sound conductors prized was actually just a sound, and a woman could produce it just as well as a man. Consider the case of Abby Conant. In 1980, she auditioned for the position of principal trombone in the Munich Philharmonic. The orchestra's music director, Sergiu Celibidache, was a legend, and he was notoriously opposed to women in his ensemble. But the audition was blind. Conant played Ferdinand David's concertino for trombone with such power and precision that Celibidache was ecstatic. "That's who we want," he declared. "That is a flesh-and-blood musician."